Hi, this is Mr. Smith, and this is day 3 of Unit 7. The bell ringer, what did you learn about Eisenhower? That's what we covered in the last day of notes. Today you'll complete the Unit 7 culture, which is to click submit and answer the following while listening to the music. What was your favorite song? And if someone were to ask you what the 50s music was like, what would you tell them in 3 to 5 sentences? And then there's the notes. And today we'll cover the 50s culture. So post-war society, in general, regarded the 50s lasting from 1945 to 1960. And so obviously that means that World War II is over. A lot of soldiers were returning home. 10 million altogether would be discharged in 1946 alone. And remember, there are others that were returning in years before then. So Congress decided we needed to make sure that they can return to society better. And so they passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or GI Bill. And that's what is commonly known as today as the GI Bill, and provided, for instance, tuition, money for having a residence or home, and also cash assistance to live on. The biggest program of this, of course, that still exists and is most well known is assistance with college tuition. So if you hear someone talk about I benefited from the GI Bill, it probably means that they received money for college. And of course, there were lots of propaganda that was issued in order to encourage people to receive this type of assistance. But of course, with all these people returning home, there soon was a housing shortage. And so one man in particular started to produce massive amounts of houses at the same time, produced in a similar fashion. And his name was William Levitt. And so eventually, towns outside of cities known as suburbs started to be created out of these mass-produced homes. And at the time, they only cost about $7,000. And of course, one of the most famous ones is known as Levittown, which was in the New York area. You can see the similar houses in the planned streets. And there was also a flight of white Americans from cities to these suburbs that was commonly known as white flight. Rural areas also started to see another drop in population as more and more farmers were able to afford mechanized equipment, so you needed less labor, and so more people started moving out of rural areas. And also about 5 million African Americans moved from rural parts of the South for the same reasons up to the urban centers in order to find work. And there you can see African American migration. These states that are the darkest shade ended up losing a large percent of their population. Population gain happened in the gray states in the north and west coast and Florida. During the war, about 8 million people, or 8 million married women entered the paid workforce. Many women refused to give up the newfound independence that they had had during World War II, encouraged by the government through propaganda like Rosie the Riveter. And then the divorce rate. The divorce rate during the 50s was incredibly low. You see, it wouldn't really start going up until just a few years before 1970. There was also a dramatic increase in the number of babies born, going from 19 for every 1,000 people to 25. So this resulted in, at that point, the largest generation born in American history. And you can see the birth rate continued during the baby boom the whole way until when it ended in the early 60s. And of course, it was a consumer-based economy with all kinds of goods and services being produced now that they were done with the wartime production. And so lots of banks through credit cards started offering revolving loans in order to purchase some of these items. And of course, it would depend upon what they were buying and sometimes what store, because often stores themselves would offer some type of credit card. And then, of course, the automobile went from producing 39 million to 74 million by the end of the 1950s per year. And by 1960, 80% of American families had at least one car. This is more than the rest of the world put together. And of course, in order to attract customers, car companies would start to offer a lot of differentiation. In other words, different types of cars with different styles or luxury items in order to attract customers. The cars did become heavier and more powerful, so that means that reduce your gas mileage. And a lot of people think they were safer back then, but actually the opposite is true. And so families living in the suburbs increased the demand for vehicles as people still worked in the cities but lived in the suburban areas. And so lots of other types of industry would spring up around the fact that more people had automobiles, drive-in theaters, motels, a place that you could quickly stop at and go right into your room, shopping malls, fast food restaurants. All these started to bring up because of the reliance on the automobile. And there you can see a variety of foods that started to become popular in the 1950s. And of course, also encouraging this would be Interstate Highway Act of 1956, one of the biggest public works projects in the world. $26 billion spent on 40,000 miles of highways that connected the different states. Sometimes 4 lanes or more for high-speed driving, and obviously an enormous amount of entrance and exit ramps to let people go back and forth into at least modest-sized towns. And there you can see a map of the interstate highway system. And then, of course, there was the Red Scare. During the Great Depression, thousands had joined the Communist Party looking for a new sense of hope and purpose. But by the 50s, of course, we became concerned because of the Cold War, so we started hunting for communists to expose them as possible traitors. The Truman Loyalty Program was an attempt to identify communists. And, of course, Senator Joe McCarthy in Congress also held investigations into possible communists, although often he claimed people were communists in a wide amount, so he would accuse hundreds of people, and it would turn out maybe 1 or 2 were guilty, but then other ones were innocent, and their reputations would often be ruined. In the House was the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, that attempted to expose Hollywood people that were involved with the Communist Party as well. In fact, there was a group of directors, writers, and actors that would be exposed. Witnesses were often permitted to make accusations, though, without any type of evidence. And so many, of course, used the Fifth Amendment, so that way they didn't have to testify against themselves. Some refused to testify even though they weren't actually communists because they didn't think it was right for them to be asked about their political beliefs. But of course, many ended up being blacklisted as a result when no one would hire them. But TV did start becoming incredibly popular. The big 3 network, CBS, NBC, and ABC, would dominate. Millions of people would tune in to watch television shows every evening starting in the 1950s, including a wide variety of classic shows. Probably the most famous would be I Love Lucy. And teenagers, instead of working full-time jobs, many decided to stay in school for the first time, and a number more would go to college. Often they started working part-time jobs instead at some of these new places that grew up around automobiles. And a wide variety of styles started to appear that were distinct to the 1950s as well, along with some specific terms that developed in the 50s that are still used today. But teenagers did desire to become independent. Most rebellious teens, though, did not use drugs or commit crimes. The rebellion was often an exaggeration and really relegated to different cultural aspects that were cropping up for the first time, like rock and roll. And rock and roll combined black rhythm and blues, country and western, and had a heavy rhythm that sounded different than music from the past, so often adults would be concerned about it. And a wide variety of popular artists that many even remember today became incredibly popular throughout the country in the 1950s. And also a variety of toys, because there is a big consumer-based economy now. People were starting to buy products just for their kids to have fun, something that was unusual for the past when the standard of living was lower, including comic books. And there also be advancements in medicine as well. Polio was a major concern, and luckily there would be a fight against that through the vaccine. Also the first organ transplant, so advances were being made in medicine as well. So for the remainder of the period, don't forget to complete the culture assignment and any of the other assignments from unit number 7.